In this example, a donkey and ogre are going to teach us something about work and energy. So I've brought back the familiar looking donkey and ogre. They are as poorly drawn as ever. The ogre says, "I'd like to scale this castle wall. Perhaps that friendly donkey there will help me." And amazingly, the ogre just brought in all this equipment. Maybe that's the equipment he was testing in the last example. And then what's he going to say next? He says, "Okay, pull." Donkey's looking a little bit nervous there, I think. Donkey says, "If I'm going to pull the ogre up the castle wall with this rope, he's going to have to gain in gravitational energy. But gravitational force does negative work to him, which makes this impossible to do since the negative work cancels the positive work I do." Now I want to pause here for a second before advancing the slide. Donkey is trying to argue that this is fundamentally impossible based on physics. And even though maybe this situation looks improbable, I don't think there's any law of physics that says that this can't be done. I mean, the one issue that might come up is if the ogre is excessively massive. I mean, ogres are kind of big, I guess, right? Compared to donkeys. That maybe donkey wouldn't actually be able to do it just based on that. But if we lightened it, like if the ogre were as light as a feather, let's say, obviously this should be possible. And if these pulleys were also not very heavy, obviously this should be possible, right? So donkey can't be right. So what mistakes is he making there? And I think what this illustrates is the importance of defining the system when making statements about energy, and in particular when you're trying to combine those statements into an argument. So I want to look maybe at like what system is he thinking about or is he referring to in the first part of his statement. When he says about the ogre, he's saying he's going to have to gain in gravitational energy. Well, for that part of the statement, his system to me is clearly ogre and gravity is also included there, because if you say that there's gravitational energy that needs to be gained, that means gravity has to be in your system, right? But then he goes on and says, but gravitational force does negative work to him. What system is he thinking about there? So the issue is, and this is sometimes a point of confusion, I've said in the last couple examples that if you have a form of energy in your analysis, like if you do W equals delta E, right? So maybe both of these, we're thinking about the overall concept for work and energy that connects the two of them is that work is equal to a change in energy. If I'm going to include gravity on the energy side of this, it must be in the system. But if I say that gravity does work, as Donkey is now saying here in the second part of his statement, but gravitational force does negative work to him, that's cheating. You can't have gravity on both sides of this. And so in order for that statement to work, the system would have to be just the ogre and not include gravity. So when he says, which makes this impossible to do since the negative work cancels the positive work that I do, it turns out for this second system, that is actually correct. If I said, hey, work is equal to a change in energy here, for this second system, it would just be 0 equals 0. No net work is done, even though I sometimes don't like to use the term net work. Anyway, because it's not often defined in physics texts. But if I think about the sum total of all the works done by the forces on this system, and I include gravity as one of them, and the force of the donkey through all these pulleys and everything, which really are just there to transmit that force, those two works, one is positive, the other is negative, the total amount would be 0. And if gravity is not in the system, the only type of energy that ogre could gain or lose is kinetic energy. And if he starts at rest, is lifted up, and then remains at rest, his energy change is therefore also 0. But in the first case, like for this system, W equals delta E, for the system of the ogre plus gravity, the way I'd interpret that is I would say, well, the work done is definitely the work done by the donkey, and the energy gained by the ogre is mgh. So this would be the appropriate interpretation of this formula following that first system. But again, when you combine them, you get kind of a weird result, because this cancellation doesn't happen for the choice of system the donkey started with. So that's a pretty at-length discussion there, but let's see how Ogre deals with this situation. He might deal with it more cleverly than I have, perhaps. He says, that's wrong because you can't define a system that has gravitational energy and has the force of gravity doing work to it. So that's basically saying what I said, but a lot briefer, right? A system that has been described to have gravitational energy tacitly assumed the force of gravity is an internal force. So that's kind of like what happens here. When I include gravity in a system, it means that that force is internal to the system, which means if that as a conservative force has an energy form associated with it, can be regarded as internal to the system. In other words, W equals delta E can be thought of as like work is done by external things. Change in energy represents an internal response of the system.